Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. We live in a world decisively organized everywhere by capitalism. Capitalism is a particular way for organizing the production of goods and services, and today it's extremely interdependent and interconnected globally through multinational corporations, foreign direct investment, international trade, lending and borrowing, currency and bond markets, and in other ways. At the same time, though, capitalism is highly uneven. For a really stark example, think about how different capitalism is in so-called Canada from what it is in Haiti. There are very deep structural inequalities in how capitalism has developed over time, starting in England over 4 centuries ago and spreading all over the world. So we live in a capitalist world, which is certainly not flat. It's more like a pyramid. It's very hierarchical. What's more, capitalism is not just about producing commodities that are produced by firms that compete with each other while they employ people who work for wages. The system of states is also part of capitalism. That's something which is unfortunately understood by too few people on the left. So competition between states needs to be understood as part of capitalist competition. This means then we live in one world, a capitalist world that's uneven, hierarchical, and within which there's a lot of rivalry, both between companies and states, a lot of conflict as well as cooperation. To understand all this, the concept of imperialism can be helpful. However, we have to make sure that it's not trivialized by just reducing it to meaning what the United States does, which is what some people on the left do. It's also a mistake to take what Lenin wrote in 1916 in his pamphlet, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, as the definitive basis for a theory of imperialism. And that's because Lenin was not, I think, entirely right at the time, and also capitalism has changed in important ways since then. But imperialism can be a way of understanding how capitalism is a global system that's organized hierarchically in a way that drains wealth from most of the world to the regions where capitalism is most developed, to the benefit of capital in those societies above all. At the top of this pyramid, we still find the United States. Below it, other imperialist states, including the UK, Germany, France, Russia, Canada, and China, which we're going to be talking about today, and Australia. Below them are sub-imperialist states with regional power, and at the bottom, most of the countries of the world. I think it's helpful to think about this as what Lenin called an imperialist chain, a hierarchy of states engaged in both economic and geopolitical competition. This episode is the second of 2 episodes of Victor's Children about imperialism today. The first one focused on the United States, and this one is going to be focused on China, and we'll also talk a little bit about Russia. Listeners who are interested in imperialism in general, and Canadian imperialism in particular, might also want to go back and check out episode 10 of Victor's Children, where the guest was Todd Gordon. But today, my guests are Ashley Smith and Kevin Lynn. Ashley was a guest on the recent episode on U.S. imperialism, and Kevin was a guest back on episode 3 of Victor's Children, talking about China from 1949 to the present. So could you introduce yourselves? Maybe Kevin first?
Sure. Thanks, David. So my name is Kevin Lin. I have been working on issues relating to labor struggle and political economy in China for many years. And in recent years, I've turned more of my attention to this question of U.S.-China rivalry, having seen how these tensions between U.S. and China wrapped up over the last 8 to 10 years. And having lived in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and in the US, I really have seen the rivalry played out from sort of different standpoints. But, I also always want to emphasize the importance of grounding the discussion around US-China rivalry and imperialism through the perspective of class relations and labor, which is, really what I have been focused on for many years.
Ashley Smith, I'm the production manager for Spectre Journal. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective, and I've been tracking, in particular, the U.S.-China rivalry for the last 15, 20 years as it developed coming out of the 1990s and the whole neoliberal boom. And now it's really come to a head. So the question of how the left approaches this central antagonism at the heart of global capitalism, I think, is a pressing issue around which there's tremendous confusion, and it's time for clarity in precisely the way that Kevin is talking about, that we have to, in the US, oppose US imperialism as our top priority, but provide no political support to China and Chinese imperialism, and instead build solidarity from below amongst the left forces throughout the world, and especially the labor movements in both countries, which are going to be pitted against one another with the return of new nationalist industrial policies on all sides of the world economy right now. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Maybe before we go any further, you could say something about the book, which I know the two of you are collaborating with others on for Haymarket.
Kevin, do you want to do that?
Yeah, so hopefully this is going to come out next year. So the book is really kind of an introduction for leftists in the US, in Canada, in other parts of the world around both the question of Chinese capitalism, social movement, labor struggle, feminist struggle, environmental struggles in China, but also this question of US-China rivalry. I think at this moment, it is useful to have a book that I think orient the left internationally around this question, because as we're going to discuss, there are so many misunderstanding and confusions and problems when it comes to thinking about this question of US-China rivalry and imperialism, and even just understanding what's happening, the dynamics of capitalism, class relations. So I think we want to do this book so that people who are interested in those questions but don't necessarily know a lot already use it as a point for the discussions.
Yeah, definitely a book that listeners should look out for when it comes out next year.
Yeah, just to add, there are other authors that we're working with. Obviously, Kevin and myself, but also Rosa Liu and Eli Friedman are the co-authors. So each with their own specialties. So it'll be a very good volume for people to use. And the tentative working title, we haven't finalized it, but is Against Imperialism, Capitalism, the US-China Rivalry, and International Solidarity.
Okay, that's hopefully next year from Haymarket. All right, let's talk about China. So China has changed enormously since the Chinese Communist Party government began to open to foreign investment in the late 1970s, along with other so-called reforms to Chinese society. But there are also areas of continuity between that era. The era that began then, there was continuity between that and the previous era, which went from 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party came to power, through till the late 1970s. So, Kevin, could you start us off by talking just a little bit about where China was fitting in the world system in the decades between 1949 and the late 1970s?
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said about this period. But I think one thing to emphasize is, before China's economic miracles in the last couple of decades, there was already a great deal of heavy industrialization in China between the 1950s and the 1970s. Despite sometimes interruptions by political campaigns, there were actually China's heavy industrial economic growth was actually pretty steady throughout that 3 decades period. And this is widely acknowledged to have laid the ground for China's subsequent economic development. So in that sense, there is definitely continuity. So China's industrialization over the last 3-4 decades didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on high industrialization during the earlier period. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that all throughout this period between 1950s and 1970s, despite having, pretty good job security and some basic welfare provisions, industrial workers in China never had workplace democracy. I think sometimes, especially now, more than even before, there is some, at least on part of some on the left, there is some romanticism about that period of Chinese history. And I think, again, there's a lot to be said about that period, which is very politically controversial among some people. But I think one thing that I think is hard to disagree is workers never had democracy in terms of decision making, in terms of managing their workplace. Again, with the caveat, they did enjoy better job security and some welfare and health insurance, etc. So when China start transitioning from that period toward the market economy in the 1980s and 1990s, workers never had any say in the system because they were never in a position where they actually had decision-making power. Although there were some cases, where state sector workers resisted privatization of the state industry, there's a continuity in the sense that workers were always subject to control. It could be by bureaucrats or by capitalists, but they were never really the ruling class of China for the last 7 decades.
Ashley, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree with everything that Kevin was just saying. I'll just say that China's position in the world system is radically different today than it was in the period that Kevin was just summarizing, because Mao's China emerges out of a victorious nationalist revolution. I don't think it was a socialist revolution. It wasn't led by working class people, and it didn't establish workers' democracy and production for human need. Instead, a bureaucratic ruling class established its dominance over the society and made a priority of national development, national economic development, whose precondition was the exploitation of both workers and the peasantry in a process of what Marx called primitive accumulation of capital. And the position that China was in was of an underdeveloped economy in a world system dominated by the Western powers, squared off in a contest with the USSR's Eastern Bloc. And for a while, China was a part of that Eastern Bloc. And then it developed an antagonism with Russia itself and increasingly tried to make its own way in the world, leading at one point a bloc of non-aligned nations that were in between the two major blocks of imperial conflict, the US's bloc with NATO powers and the USSR's Eastern Bloc powers. But throughout China's period from 1949 up to 1979, its top priority was national economic development. And that sometimes included a classic 5-year plan like Stalin's Russia pioneered, vacillating with attempts to rush the process of development, like with Mao's Great Leap Forward, when he tried to, overcome the underdevelopment with acts of sheer will that produced a gigantic economic catastrophe and a famine in the country. And so then the country went back to a kind of state-led national development 5-year plan in the wake of the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. But throughout, from 1949 up through really today, the priority of the state has been national economic development. It's pursued different strategies. In the period up to 1979, it was more an autarkic strategy of a separation from the world economy. And since 1979, it's been one of integration within the world economy in an attempt to compete within the broader system of global capitalism.
Yeah, could you just pick up on that last point? I mean, we go back to the end of the 1970s after Mao's death, and Deng Xiaoping and the group around him came into the control of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. China begins to reorient itself in relation to the global economy, in relation to global capitalism. So could you just give listeners a bit of an introduction to events that took place between the late 1970s and the end of the 20th century with respect to China's relationship to global capitalism?
Yeah, well, I'll begin, and then Kevin, you should jump in with what your take is on this period. But I think that the key thing is that China in the early 1970s emerged from the Cultural Revolution in a deep political and economic crisis. That is, that it was falling further and further behind in the competition within the world system for, in its case, national economic development. And the whole world capitalist system entered a crisis in the 1970s. And in China, it took a particularly acute form of a fight between factions within the bureaucracy. One that wanted to carry on, in some ways, the tradition of the Cultural Revolution that Mao had pioneered, including his widow was part of one faction, and another faction around Deng Xiaoping was committed to an opening up to the world economy. So there was a sharp faction fight within the Chinese ruling class, within the bureaucratic ruling class, between these two different strategies, a kind of continuity with an autarkic method of development and a reorientation toward integration with the world economy. And Deng Xiaoping won that factional battle and pioneered a strategy of, instead of separate autarkic national development, of opening China both internally to capitalist market mechanisms and externally to global capitalism's international market mechanisms. So he opened the process of marketization by encouraging township village enterprises to develop in the countryside, allowing the companies to emerge and hire workers and develop various industries, and also opening special economic zones, catering to multinational corporations to use Chinese labor as cheap labor to manufacture for the world economy. So you can see there's a dramatic reorientation of the economic strategy away from autarkic national development based on internal exploitation of the country's laboring force, its working class and its peasantry, towards marketization and an orientation on the global capitalist system. Predictably, what this does is create a dynamic of all the kind of normal laws of capitalist growth and crisis. And so at the end of the 1970s, at the end of the 1980s, there develops both an economic crisis and a real desire on the part of especially students, but also the broader working class, for democratization to go along with marketization of the economy. And that produced the gigantic Tiananmen Square uprising, which included not only students, but also sections of the working class. And Deng Xiaoping put that down with the utmost brutality. And for a while, it returned China to a condition of relative isolation. But soon the corporations lobbied the governments of the West, in particular the United States and the European capitalist powers, to reopen the spigot of investment in China. And in the course of the 1990s, you have a massive return to international investment in China and a serious expansion of the Chinese economy as more capital floods into the global capital floods into the country, sets up operations in new special economic zones. And also you have the increased privatization of sections of the previously state-owned industry. And so you have China's deep integration with the world economy really begin to take off. That said, one of the things that the Chinese bureaucracy has done is not go full scale into a neoliberal direction. They held on to whole sections of the economy under state control. So they have their state-owned enterprises, or basically state capitalist industries, in the commanding heights of the economy and strategic sectors around, in particular, oil and natural gas and others that are going to be at the heart of the economy. So they balanced between a state-owned system and an opening to both domestic and international private capital. And that contradictory dynamic, and for a while, led the U.S. in particular to be wary of whether China should be admitted to the World Trade Organization. And finally, at the end of the 1990s, the U.S. decides, well, they still have their state-owned enterprises, but will allow China to join the WTO at the end of the 1990s, going into the early 2000s. And once that happens, China really takes off as an economic power in the world system and ascends up the ranks of the world economy rapidly to become the second largest economy in the world.
Kevin, do you have anything you'd like to add about the late 20th century? That I would just mention one thing I think it's important for listeners to understand, and that's that there was no grand plan. It was really a trial and error process, a process of experimentation that led to Deng Xiaoping and the key figures in the Chinese ruling class moving from where they were in the late 1970s through to the situation we find ourselves in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was not only no grand plan. If you look at the period from the mid 1970s up until even now, there was a series of crises. I actually mentioned earlier about the crisis just after the Cultural Revolution, and there was a crisis toward the mid and end of 1980s, and again a little bit of crisis toward the end of 1990s, and then during the Great Recession of 2007 and 8. And it has both economic dimensions and political dimensions. So very often the leadership of the CCP would try to respond to this crisis, sometimes in a very haphazard way. And so there's not only no grand plan for for this kind of capitalist transition. It was really just sort of constantly responding to crisis. But very often, you may temporarily resolve one crisis, but then it may exacerbate other aspects of crisis. So it's never just kind of smooth transition. I think I also want to mention the maybe the global aspect of this. So there are both, as Ashley was mentioning, the internal dimensions, which is, for example, the kind of political crisis in the 1970s after the Cultural Revolution. There's a yearning for change in society. There's kind of economic crisis, even though there's heavy industrialization. For your average residents in China, consumer consumption remains very low. It's part of that kind of repression or sort of consumption in order to fuel the economy, fuel heavy industrialization. So there's already a lot of discontent, but there's also the global dimension, which obviously in the 1980s is the crisis of world communism, right? So there's already a sense that the Soviet Union was in trouble, Eastern Europe was in trouble. How would you move forward? So I think that global dimension also was very important. And then just finally, I think when I was preparing for this interview, I just suddenly thought about the recent visit by Henry Kissinger at the age of 100. He went to China again. It's quite interesting to think about the timing of this. He obviously, with all his war crimes in Southeast Asia, in Chile, and many other places, has been considered a friend to the Chinese people by the Chinese state, because he was instrumental in opening up the relationship in rapprochement between U.S. and China in the 1970s through his visits to China with Nixon. And what I actually was saying, what that led to was basically China opening up its economy and began to be incorporated into global economy, capitalist world economy. So that was very instrumental in like the U.S. and China is really instrumental in collaborating to integrate China. So for a long time, the U.S.-China relationship again, it's be hard to think back now because how much tension there is to think. Actually, there was a period of like 2-3 decades when U.S. and China relationship were very close. Sure, there were problems along the way, but there was also a consensus that China economic development is both good in terms of opening up its market, providing cheap labor, but also by politically that there's always this notion that if China economic growth continues, its politics is going to democratize. So there was this assumption that sustains U.S.-China cooperation for much of the 1980s, 90s, and even most of the early 2000s as well, up until the last 10 years or so. So I think it's important to remember that somehow that that there was always that tension. Actually, the U.S. was very instrumental in integrating China into global capitalism.
I'll just add to that just a quick point that I think it's important to remember that China coming online was an instrumental part of the big neoliberal boom from the beginning of the 1980s up through the Great Recession, because it provided a cheap labor source for the world economy that helped drive down on an international scale the cost of labor. So if you think about what happened in all the advanced countries, they engaged in lean production to squeeze as much as possible out of their domestic working class and replace workers with machines, make the remaining workers work longer and harder for less money, and then globalize to find cheap labor havens. And China was at the heart of that. So that produced the phenomenon that Kevin was just explaining of what's his name called Chimerica, like the combination of China and America as really two parts of the giant neoliberal boom that benefited both states, but also, as we'll talk about, has now brought them into increasing conflict as that boom has been replaced by a period of crisis and slump.
So, Ashley, you'd mentioned in 2001, end of 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Can you say a little bit about how Chinese imperialism developed between 2001 and the adoption of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013?
Yeah, this is the period of China's takeoff as an economic and then geopolitical and, to a lesser extent, but increasingly so, a military power in its own right. As I was saying earlier, China if you look at the growth charts, China grows through the neoliberal boom with ups and downs and the periods of crisis at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, and then and during the Asian financial crisis has a little bit of a setback, and has a little bit of a setback around 2001 again. But after 2001, and the recovery of the world system up through the Great Recession, there is a massive expansion of the Chinese economy, and that's when it really ascends up the rankings of overall economic power to become the second largest economy. And with that, it becomes increasingly economically assertive, geopolitically assertive, and militarily assertive. And that's happening at the same time as U.S. imperialism is going into its own crisis. Part of that brought on by the rise of China as a potential economic competitor as a result of the neoliberal boom, but most dramatically, the Washington's defeat in Iraq, which bogs it down in 2 decades of counterinsurgency, and then the Great Recession, which hammers the U.S. and Europe in particular hard. But China engages in a massive stimulus plan, the largest as a share of GDP in the world, and that super accelerates the Chinese expansion. So at that point, after the recovery from the brief crisis in 2009, China becomes really the growth center of the world economy, and much of the world in the global South is kept in boom because of their exports of raw materials to the industrial might of China. And I think at that point, you have within the bureaucracy, particularly under Xi Jinping, a sense of an opportunity to take advantage of on the 3 fronts of the economy, geopolitics, and military projection. And so Xi Jinping basically sees the moment to project China economically into the world system as not only a site for exploitation of cheap Chinese labor, but a potential source of developing whole sections of the world. So they launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this giant $1 trillion project, between $1 trillion and $8 trillion project when they designed it, to extend loans and credits to over 150 countries around the world to nominally help them develop, but it also serves a subsidiary function of establishing extractivist industries in a lot of these countries to export raw materials back to China and make China a new hub of the world economy and a potential rival to the United States. And so China in the process becomes a major exporter of foreign direct investment. And it, along with that, it begins to develop geopolitical relationships all around the world, not only geopolitical relationships, but security relationships, as it begins to assert its interests along with the economic interests it's asserting in the world. So it develops all sorts of pacts, most importantly, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia and Central Asian states that has expanded to include countries as observers like Iran, and also the BRICS bloc, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa bloc, which also is very geopolitically important. And parallel to this is the modernization of the Chinese military, and in particular, the establishment of island bases in the South China Sea to project China's power within the Asia Pacific, and also to deter the kind of ongoing presence of the United States in the Asia Pacific. Remember, the United States is really the main Asian Pacific power against which China is rising. And then China really invests in developing its naval capacities to deter and confront the U.S. forces, but also the states within the Asia Pacific, and developing all sorts of antagonisms, especially over the island bases with other countries in the region. So you have this rise of China as an economic power, a geopolitically assertive power, and increasingly military power over the course of the 2000s up through the launching of Belt and Road. And not only that, basically saying in 2015, with the launch of China 2025, that China is going to jump up the value chain, that it's going to become a high-tech capitalist power, that it's not just going to be an export processing operation, but it's going to start investing in semiconductor manufacturing of its own telecommunications equipment. You think of Huawei, and also of its solar industry and electrical vehicle industry. And that brings it into competition at a higher level of conflict with the European, Japanese, and U.S. manufacturers and companies. So you see the emergence of this new capitalist and imperialist power in the shape of China under Xi Jinping.
Kevin, is there anything you'd like to add to what Ashley said? And can you also explain a little bit in more detail what the Belt and Road Initiative is and what its goals are?
Sure. I think I can still remember, and you can really feel the growing confidence of the Chinese state and certain section of the public as well in China throughout the first decade of the 21st century, because of the economic growth, because of the ability to project power at the global stage, or at least show its power at global stage. You can see that the self-confidence gaining in that period. There was this kind of sort of philosophy, if you will, of sort of laying low on the part of the Chinese state for, in the 1980s and 90s. It wants to not, be flashy about its power. But you see that gradually being cast away in the 2000s and especially after the 2010s. And a couple of results I should mention, and actually already touched on briefly. A couple of results of that economic development. One is industrial ore capacity. China is so good at producing things that it's can't really consume what's being produced, and higher wages among the working class. It started off as mostly recent rural immigration to the cities, working on very low wages in low-skilled jobs. But through both demographic changes, but also, very importantly, workers' struggles, wages were growing very fast, sometimes double-digit per year, but from very low base. But it was growing very fast. So by the end of the first decade of 2000s of the 21st century, the kind of wage advantage in China is no longer as much as before compared to, say, Southeast Asia or other parts of the world. So you began to see capital moving both within China and also out of China. And that comes to the point about One Belt One Road. But I should also mention briefly, this is also around 2012, 2013 is when China started to deindustrialize. Deindustrialization in the sense of the percentage of the sort of decline percentage of industrial workers as a percentage of the labor force that started to decline. That peaked around 2012, 2013 and started to decline. And that actually also led to a decline in worker struggles in the manufacturing sector. Which is something else I think is important to keep in mind, that not only the political economy, but also in terms of labor movement, labor struggle. So BRI, so the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's useful to maybe think of that in terms of three dimensions or underpinnings. One is economic, one is geopolitical, and one is ideological. The economic dimension is, I think, the fact that Chinese capitalism reached a stage where it needs to, or it wants to export its capital for higher profit margins, and to play into places where there's lower labor cost, and also to develop overseas markets for the products that China is producing. So that's not really surprising to your listeners, David. But this is the kind of economic dimension. There's also the geopolitical dimension, which is that China really wants to chart its own system of trade and diplomatic relations. In part because I think the more established global trade and financial institutions like the WTO and IMF and the World Bank are not very friendly toward China, essentially, because they're not started by China, or they're not really controlled by China. So there are also allegations against Chinese China dumping its product into the US and European markets. So in a way that China was trying to chart its own institutions, and this is part of the there are other security and trade relations institutions that China was setting up. But this is a key piece of that geopolitical, which is linked to the economic, but also geopolitical dimension. But I think it's also important to emphasize there is also a ideological underpinning to this. That's why it's called Belt and Road, right? It's One Belt and Road, recalling this kind of bygone year of Chinese glory, right? Glorious history in which China was kind of the center of the world. It has all those trade relations with other countries, other nations or empires in Asia, in Europe, etc., etc. So I think this is really linked to the whole ideological project of the China dream, or the reviving the China nation. So I think this is also kind of, if you will, a prestige project. So it's all that geopolitical, it's all that economic underpinning, but it's also ideological. And that also means, just to finish on that point, sometimes it's done in a very haphazard way. Sometimes the announcement and the news are actually sounds better than the reality. I mean, in part, it's kind of to be expected because it's such a big project. The implementation is going to be very uneven. But I think also sometimes, Chinese investment that went back to decades ago, that was made decades ago, also get, wrapped under this BRI kind of umbrella. And of course, running into all the problem with local government, with labor, with environmental groups. And I think I recently read that Italy is considering to withdraw from the project. So I think it started really well, if you will, but it kind of falling apart to some degree. But it does have, I think, has differentiated impacts in different parts of the world. But overall, I think it's all that. But I think it's a project that is also at least in partial crisis.
It's interesting because, of course, we probably are more familiar with the overreach of the U.S. ruling class and its tendency to sometimes announce, or boast about things that it can't actually follow through on. But that's not a property unique to one ruling class. Far from it. So we've touched on the issue of military power, which is, of course, one aspect of imperialism. So, Ashley, can you share some thoughts about how you assess the power of the Chinese military to act outside of China's land borders at the moment?
Yeah, I think the beginning point when you talk about Chinese imperialism is just to reassert that although China's a rising power, its military power is very small compared to the United States. If you look at the US spends several times what the Chinese military spends. And like the Biden's latest budget is $886 billion. I think the last Chinese military budget, I think, came in around $300 billion. So you're talking about an annual expenditure by the U.S. that's much, much larger. The U.S. has around 800 military bases all around the world, and it has an unrivaled international Air Force and Navy up until recently, and armed presence all around the world, in particular in Asia. If you look at the bases that are in the Asia Pacific that the U.S. has, they've had many for a long time, most importantly in South Korea, but also in Okinawa and Guam, and you can just list them all out. So there are already bases that are inherited from the Cold War that encircle China. So that's the military environment in which China is beginning to operate and assert itself. And so the first thing that China has done, which I talked about a little bit, is transform these island reefs into military bases in the South China Sea and claim a huge section of the South China Sea as its historic waters. And that it's doing for several reasons. Number one, it's a deterrent to the U.S., which has all these military bases in the region. Number two, there are enormous fisheries in the area that are contested places. And so the Chinese economy has an interest in declaring those waters as part of its fisheries, and undersea reserves of oil and natural gas, which are also contested. So China wants to claim those. And then the final thing, these are international shipping waterways that are key choke points in the world economy, places like the Straits of Malacca, where an incredible amount of world commerce passes. So whoever controls the oceans controls all sorts of natural resources, ability to determine what happens with international commerce, et cetera. So China's built these bases within the South China Sea. And then the second thing it's done is modernize its military, downsize its army, and increase investments in its Navy, so that now has a couple of aircraft carriers, which are far fewer than what the U.S. has, but it also has a huge fleet. I think it's larger than the U.S. now, of Navy ships, and those ships are designed to in a strategy of area access denial, so that the U.S. can be deterred from coming into waters that China claims. So it's modernized its Navy, and then it's just begun to establish international military bases. So it has one formal base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, which it's nominally an anti-terrorist, anti-piracy operation. It's also considering establishing bases in several other countries, in Sri Lanka, Equatorial New Guinea, Pakistan, and Cambodia. So China is just beginning to establish a toehold, and a lot of those countries that it's establishing those military bases in are wrapped up with the Belt and Road Initiative. And then the final thing is that it's increasingly modernizing its Air Force and intercontinental ballistic capacity. So it is rapidly developing those abilities militarily to pair with its economic and geopolitical assertion. But we have to keep all this in, we have to qualify all of this just because the enormous lead and enormous power that the U.S. has compared to China. So it's a conflict between a rising power with these increasing economic, geopolitical, and military capacities against a dominant power that has historically ruled the waves and ruled international commerce since the end of the Cold War. But now it's becoming an antagonism because the U.S. is very concerned about this increasing military capacity because it's China getting in on the game that the U.S. has dominated.
Would you add anything to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I think, we, as leftists, we in the US or in Canada or in Europe, I think definitely the first thing we should acknowledge is the still the enormous disparity between, say, the US military power and the Chinese military power. It's still not comparable despite all the modernization effort, as Ashley was mentioning. In China, definitely the Chinese military has become more capable. So that's the first thing to acknowledge. But within the region, if you're for residents in Taiwan, the military threat is very real. So there have been wrapping up of military exercise around Taiwan, especially in the last couple of years since some of the visits by US American Congress men, women. And the closer economic ties, not just economic, but also military ties between U.S. and Taiwan. So there have been a lot more military exercise and the threat of invasion. I don't think it's imminent in the sense that it's going to happen in the next few months, but I think that the threat should be taken very seriously for sure. And of course, there the territorial dispute in the South China Sea between China and other countries in Vietnam, the Philippines, etc. So within the region, China's military presence and powers remains very powerful. But at the same time, I think China has really not fought any war since 1979. That was with Vietnam. So we really don't know how capable its military is, really, because we really haven't seen it in action in any major military conflict for 40 years. So we know definitely that the projection of its military power within the region is very real, but how capable it is, I don't think anyone knows until there is a military conflict. Really how much its military can project its power on the ground. If I could mention one final thing, because sometimes I write about this briefly in articles around U.S.-China rivalry, is there was a war between U.S. and China that's called Korean War. In the U.S. sometimes it's called the Forgotten War, right? That's people remember Vietnam, remember Second World War, but Korea is kind of forgotten for many reasons, political reasons in the U.S. But that's the Korean War is very much remembered within China, and it's obviously it's war between the two Koreans, but it's very often it's also confrontation between the Chinese military and the U.S.-led UN military army. So that was still very much remembered today in China. So there's a sense of a military conflict with the U.S. It's not a distant memory. It's still people who are alive at the time were still very much remembering that in China, and sometimes it's been in movies and in televisions, in literature. So it's this and there are other military skirmishes, conflicts with the U.S. that again sometimes got forgotten in the 1990s, for example, when I think there were clashes of military aircrafts of American U.S. military aircraft near Chinese borders. So I think on the one hand, I think conflict between U.S. and China now happened because both are nuclear powers, but I don't think this is not necessarily how it's remembered or how it's thought about, say, in China. The threat of a military conflict in China is still real in people's mind. I think that's an important point to keep in mind when we think of U.S.-China rivalry.
Now, I'd like to turn to talk about some of the more specific politics on the left here, because there are more than a few people on the left today who will say, well, maybe China is capitalist, but it's not imperialist. And there are also some people on the left who would say that China is not capitalist at all. So, Kevin, how would you respond to those claims?
Yeah, I think really one has to come up with a very convoluted argument to argue that China is not capitalist. First of all, I think it's kind of, to me it's really interesting. Even up until maybe 5 years ago or 7 ago, there used to be a lot of clarity on the left. I think more clarity than now that Chinese is capitalist. But now it's often very muddied. And some people on the left are just willing to say, oh, maybe it's capitalist, maybe it's not. We don't know. So let's leave that question to the side. I don't think that's a really helpful approach. So my perspective is the perspective of labor. And the question I always want to pose is, are workers in China experiencing capitalist exploitation in which, their surplus value, their surplus labor is appropriated by capital? I think that's hard to deny that's the case. And other things like, the fact that China's state sector is very prominent. I mean, that's another argument against the idea China is capitalist. I mean, there are many historically and contemporary capitalist states where there is a big state-owned or state or public sector. And of course, there are people arguing the Chinese state intervening very actively in the economy. Again, that's just part and parcel of maybe not neoliberal capitalism, but it's part of capitalism historically. So those are not the reasons why the Chinese economy is not capitalist. I think on the question of imperialism is a lot trickier, and I want to leave more time to Ashley, because I think he really does the heavy lifting to think about this question. But I want to maybe separate out the disagreement about imperialism. I don't think there is one disagreement. I think there are different kinds of disagreement, and I think we need to treat it differently. So I think there's theoretical disagreement. I think there's empirical disagreement, and I think there's a political disagreement. So the theoretical disagreement goes back to David when you open the conversation. Is how you define imperialism. I think again I will leave it to Ashley to really talk more about the definition of imperialism, how we should think about what imperialism is and what imperialist global system is. So I think there's a theoretical question, a theoretical disagreement. I think also important is the empirical question of what's really happening in places like, say, Africa or South America or Southeast Asia. To what extent Chinese investment and Chinese extension of its power is imperialistic or is exploitative? I think that question is also not always agreed upon. I think things are really changing very fast as well. So something that people said a couple of years ago may no longer hold true empirically even today. So I think there's on the theoretical, on the empirical level, I think there could be at least productive disagreements. Now, I think what is not productive is a political disagreement in the sense that because people think U.S. is the predominant imperial power, therefore its enemy, including China, Russia, etc., cannot be imperialists, or at least they're the victims of U.S. imperialism. I think that's not a productive way or useful way or correct way of looking at the imperialist global system right now. But I do think on the first two questions, I think at least there should be more discussion. But unfortunately, I think there's not much of that. The more of the disagreement is the third kind, which is basically political. Like, we don't want to even talk about China as an imperialist power, regardless of how you define it, regardless of how much fact we bring to bear to this question. So I would just leave it to Ashley, really, who has done the intellectual heavy lifting on this question.
I agree with everything that Kevin was just saying. I think I think the questions are interrelated. And if you get the capitalist question right, you're going to get the imperialist question right. So to deny that China is capitalist today, you really have to put blinders on to the realities of the Chinese economy, the Chinese state, and the condition of workers in China. All of its corporations, whether they're state-owned or privately held, are integrated with global capitalism today and are competing in an internal market and on the international market. That is undeniable. I mean, the state corporations are listed on stock exchanges in Shanghai, and they're invested in other countries, especially through BRI. So its state economy is thoroughly integrated into global capitalism. And we have to remember that the bulk of the Chinese economy is actually privately owned. So private capital is, the majority of the economy at this point, and they are competing in the internal and the international market as well. And that logic of competition compels them to exploit workers and to compete to raise the rate of exploitation of workers. And I think it really is impossible to deny that China is capitalist. And up until the hysteria of the kind of new Cold War rhetoric that the Republican right has whipped up, most of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the business press was singing one song that China was capitalist. So I think it's undeniable that China's economy and its state-owned and privately owned sectors are competing for profit and accumulation in the world system, and the working class is exploited within that competition. And so all the things that Kevin said about the condition of workers is absolutely the case. But from really the 1970s on, it's combined this kind of state capitalism with the private free market capitalism in a specific fashion in China. And so there are other ideological blinders that people have from a definitional position, which says that if there's state ownership, it's not capitalist. But I think, as Kevin pointed out, there's a long history, especially in Europe and in other parts of the world, where state ownership is part and parcel of capitalism and not separate from it. So I think if you get the question of China being capitalist right, you're going to get the question of China being imperialist right, because the nature of capitalism is to produce imperialism. Why is that the case? Because corporations, both state-owned and privately owned, compete to maximize profit. And that competition drives them beyond their national borders to compete for position in the world market, to hoard a larger amount of the profit in the world system. So all capitalist economies have imperialism in their DNA. They have to break out beyond their national markets to the world market to compete for profit and market share and resources and cheap labor. That's the very nature of capitalism, as Marx talks about it in Das Kapital. So it's built into to capitalism, this expansionary dynamic. And corporations, state-owned and privately owned, turn to their home state, the state that they grew up within, to defend their interests globally and to negotiate trade deals to their advantage and to establish political relations to their advantage. And it's a contradictory process, but what that does is mean that economic competition produces state competition, geopolitical competition, and inevitably military competition. So with China's rise from being a marginal economy in the world system to the second largest economy in the world, with the second largest military budget and a growing network of political alliances, it is become an imperialist power that is exporting capital, that is engaged in the exploitation of countries in the global south based on extractivist industries that it's funding. It's building a military to protect those interests, and it is building geopolitical relationships with other powers to compete with its main rival and dominant power in the world system, the United States. So you really have, a situation where if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it is a duck. In other words, that China is capitalist and it's engaged in capitalist development of the very familiar characteristics, and it's developed imperialist qualities, and it's an imperialist power. And how else can you explain the rivalry now at the center of the world system between the first largest economic power, the United States, and China, except by understanding it as a capitalist-driven economic rivalry with military and geopolitical dimensions to it. So I think it's pretty obvious that it's imperialist just because it's capitalist, and it's so powerful today.
Well, this takes us to a major point of conflict between the US and China, and that is Taiwan. So, Kevin, could you start us off with a very brief history for listeners about just an introduction to the history of Taiwan?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Taiwan just historically has been part of different Chinese empires, but it has also been colonized by the Dutch for a few hundred years, and then by the Japanese in the early parts of the 20th century. But the useful starting point is the defeat of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, in China in the second half of 1940s during the Chinese Civil War with the Communist Party. So the defeated Nationalist Party fled from mainland China to Taiwan and basically set up its own base there. And in the process, it also cracked down upon local uprisings against its occupation, because the Nationalist Party was very much seen as an occupier, not just another Chinese ruler, but an occupier of Taiwan. So between 1950s and the 1980s, under the Nationalist Party in Taiwan, there were decades of what's called the White Terror, where political dissidents were persecuted, were jailed, exiled, and opposition silenced. So it was a period of dictatorship by the Nationalist Party until a opposition movement emerged and grew very strong in the 1980s. And they ended up pressuring the Nationalist Party into political democratization in the 1990s when they held the first democratic election in Taiwan. And I think it's important to also emphasize even though the majority of the population in Taiwan are what you could say ethnically Han Chinese, there is an indigenous population in Taiwan, and they have been heavily persecuted both by the Japanese and the Japanese occupation, and then also under the Nationalist Party. I think there's now more recognition of the indigenous population in Taiwan, but I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not just high ethnic Chinese; there are also indigenous population in Taiwan that face a lot of repression. I think I think this links back to the question of U.S. and China is so Taiwan under the dictatorship in the 60s and 70s underwent land reforms and industrialization. So actually, Taiwan was one of the four tigers, the original four tigers. It became industrialized and became wealthy by the 1980s and 90s. That's why it was really actually well placed when mainland China opened up its economy, opened up its market for investment. Taiwan, along with Hong Kong capital, were the earliest investment from overseas into China, and Taiwanese capital really made a huge amount of profit from the initial investment because of the disparity between the wages, the salaries in Taiwan, in mainland China. So Taiwanese capital was actually a huge beneficiary of China's economic opening up. And a lot of the Taiwanese companies and Hong Kong companies essentially serve as local suppliers and contractors to multinational companies in Japan, Korea, US, Europe, etc., etc. And obviously now we know really well the example of Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese electronics supplier maker that produce for brands in like Samsung and Apple, etc. But it's not an isolated example. There are very, very similar Taiwanese capital that operated in mainland China. And what it did, and I think this is also another point worth keeping in mind, is in the 1990s when Taiwanese capital started to invest in China, it essentially moved its factories to mainland China. And that actually undermine the labor movement in Taiwan. Remember, this was a period of democratization. Actually, there was a lot of hope for it, for the labor movement and other social movement to play a big role in Taiwanese politics. But partly because of that relocation from Taiwan to mainland China, the labor movement in Taiwan actually became much weaker as a result because of the factories. A lot of industrial capacity were gone by then. So I think that's also when we think about U.S.-China rivalry, when we think about geopolitical tensions, I think it's also important to bear in mind the impact on workers, on labor movement in all those places, in China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and also in the U.S. and other places.
So, Ashley, can you explain how you see China fitting in? How you see Taiwan fitting into global capitalism, and then a little more about how it relates to China and the U.S. today and their rivalry?
Yeah, just building off what Kevin was saying. If you think about it as a triangle, the U.S., China, and Taiwan, in the up until the Nixon and Kissinger going to China, the U.S. recognized Taiwan and its claim to be China. And then it flipped to recognizing the People's Republic of China, Mao's China, as China, and developed a one China policy and had a position vis-a-vis Taiwan of strategic ambiguity, because China, mainland China, the People's Republic of China, always regarded Taiwan as a renegade province that it wanted to annex and bring back into China proper as it saw it. And so the US had this position of what it called strategic ambiguity about Taiwan's status, that it didn't formally recognize it, but it de facto recognized it as a country, as a nation state. It also had a policy of ambiguity around whether it would defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese attack. So it would both provide military hardware to Taiwan, but be unclear if it was considered an ally that the U.S. would defend in the case of an outbreak of war, in case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So the policy that the U.S. had was hedging its bets, essentially, of recognizing China, but also de facto having a relationship with Taiwan. That was very copacetic for all parties concerned during the neoliberal boom period, where you have this profound integration of both the Chinese and American economies, but also the integration of Taiwan with both economies as well. And that produced this phenomenon that Kevin was just summarizing, of the development of Taiwan as one of the original tiger economies of the Asia Pacific. And also, and this is the most important thing, the center of the high-tech industry globally. And a good new book that summarizes all of this is by Chip Miller, that just came out. His politics are iffy, but the book is brilliant, called Chip War, and it has whole chapters on the development of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. But Taiwan becomes the epicenter of the high-tech manufacturing, both based on plants that it has in Taiwan and its role in running factories in mainland China. So now the Taiwanese corporation TSMC and others produce 90% of the world's most advanced microchips. And those microchips are in everything from your Apple phone to your washing machine to your motor vehicle, to military planes, to regular commercial aircraft like the F-35, the most advanced fighter jet that the U.S. has, is dependent on these microchips that are manufactured in Taiwan. So you have, this deep integration of the three economies, Taiwan, the United States, and China, that also has strategic military applications. So it's all fine when all the countries are getting along. In fact, as Kevin was just saying, Foxconn produces most of the world's iPhones, and most of their factories are in China. And Foxconn is a Taiwanese corporation. So you have this profound integration of these three economies. But with China's dramatic rise as an economic power, its attempt to climb up the value chain through China 2025 and produce its own microchips that can rival the high-tech ones that are produced in Taiwan. And with all the military applications, the U.S. becomes concerned that these microchips can fall into the hands of the Chinese state. And so you have the emergence of this chip war in which Taiwan is the central battleground. The chip war, what does that look like? Trump and Biden start putting sanctions on Chinese high-tech companies to prevent them from developing the high-end microchips and putting them in its military, and also protect the U.S. From being dependent on any microchips that are coming from China. And in the case of Biden, trying to onshore the production of the high-end microchips into the United States so they're not vulnerable to a Chinese attack in the case of Taiwan. So what had been a copacetic triangle of economic and geopolitical relations suddenly becomes a battleground in which Taiwan is right at the heart of it. So China becomes more assertive of its claim over the renegade province of Taiwan. The U.S. starts to use Taiwan and its support of Taiwan in a provocative way to irritate China. And Pelosi's visit is one example. Biden has also blurred the policy of strategic ambiguity, making it seem like the U.S. would directly intervene to defend Taiwan against a Chinese military attack. And so you see that you've got a situation where China and the U.S. are now at loggerheads, and they're beginning to fragment the world economy, in particular to pull apart this copacetic relationship into one that's increasingly antagonistic with their, sanctions and protectionism and this policy of de-risking, of disconnecting the U.S. and Chinese economies in strategic areas with military applications. So now it's become a profound antagonism and really a key flashpoint of a potential military conflict that has massive repercussions for the world economy. Because as I said, 90% of the most advanced microchips, which are in everything, are produced by Taiwan. So the stakes of the Battle of Taiwan over Taiwan between the U.S. and China are extremely high. That said, I don't think there's any war coming anytime soon, but it's ominous what China has done in asserting its rights to the island with its military exercises, and then the massive military exercises that the U.S. has been conducting in the Asia Pacific, in particular around the Philippines. So this is a very frightening situation, and lost amidst all of this is the Taiwanese people's right to self-determination and their ability to be free of the interference and intervention by either imperial power, the immediate antagonist in the case of China, but also the United States, which is using the question of Taiwan for its own imperialist purposes, not in a genuine commitment to any kind of self-determination of the Taiwanese people.
Thanks. Picking up on that, perhaps, Kevin, you could say a few things about what the position of socialists in the West about Taiwan should be.
Yeah, I agree with what actually was sketching out. I think at the very, very bottom, we should support Taiwanese people's self-determination and, and against any aggression or coercion from anyone, right? So I think that's the very basic position. I also think, the provocation by the U.S. ruling class is escalating the tensions. I think the Chinese state is, in a way, being cornered. I don't think, and I agree with actually here, I don't think there's going to be any war anytime soon. And I also don't think the CCP leadership is interested in pursuing a military action if they can avoid it. I think some people may argue, well, because the economy is not going well, maybe, the leadership can use this as a way to distract the public. Not impossible, but I also think it's smart enough to know it may backfire. And maybe in a sense, I think the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think gave more pulse to the CCP leadership to think twice before it start any military incursion into Taiwan. So but having said all that, I think if they feel they're really being cornered, and if they feel they have to defend whatever territory claim over Taiwan because of popular pressure, because the public may turn against the CCP if it is seen as not protecting its territorial claim over Taiwan, then I think you may see a situation where there could be a serious military conflict. But regardless, the people who are going to lose the most are the people in Taiwan. It's not going to be, there are going to be some military casualties on the Chinese side, but I think the people who are going to bear the most brunt will be the Taiwanese people. So I think it's important to de-escalate the tensions. And I think as leftists in the US, in Canada, in other places, I think, of course, I think it's important to oppose any Western provocations, but I think it should not be done at the expense of ignoring or overlooking the rights of Taiwanese people for self-determination. I should also say one thing. I think it's also important to pay attention to what the people, the progressive activists in Taiwan are saying and thinking. I want to encourage people to check out the publications called New Bloom, BLOOM, which is a progressive publication in Taiwan that publish regularly on issues in Taiwan and also broadly in the Asia Pacific region, to see what leftists and what progressive people in Taiwan are actually thinking, rather than just assuming what they're thinking or denying them a voice. And I do want to point out, maybe to wrap up this question, there's different opinions in Taiwan on the left. So there are kind of two lefts. One left is what's being called the pro-unification left, which used to be more progressive, right? Those are the people who are normally who often had Marxist leanings, and they supported some kind of unification with mainland China. Decades ago, that was in contact, that was a more progressive position to take. But by now, it's a very conservative position. It's basically saying, we really do not care if China or Taiwan is capitalist or not, or what kind of economic and political system they have. We just want to maybe avoid war and have unification. But there are also another left, again, for lack of a better term, sometimes called pro-independent left. But I think there's also nuance in that position. Not everyone is advocating for outright independence of Taiwan, which to all intents and purposes is essentially a de facto independent state. I should mention that. But others are saying, at least we don't want. We want to chart an independent, progressive position on the on the Taiwan-China question, and U.S.-China question that is opposed to all sort of imperialism, U.S. imperialism, Chinese imperialism, but also opposed to capitalism in Taiwan, in China, in the U.S. So I think there's nuance in the position, but I think at the bottom that we should not ignore what people are in Taiwan are thinking, rather than just like, okay, because U.S. China are in conflict and U.S. is supporting Taiwan, therefore let's ignore what they people in Taiwan say and just oppose anything that Taiwan does. I think that's a really, really misguided position to take.
Okay. One thing we haven't talked about, but we've spent like a few minutes just touching on at least, is the relationship between Russia and China. Since obviously Russia compared to China is a much smaller player within the world system. But Ashley, could you say a few things about that relationship?
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship. If you think about the history, it's quite wild, the twists and turns, because during the Cold War, in the early part of the Cold War, China under Mao and Stalin's Russia were allies. And then they became antagonists, largely because Mao thought that China was being reduced by the USSR to a satellite and not being provided with the technical, military, and industrial support that China wanted. And then there was an actual border skirmish between China and the USSR. And for a while, they broke off relationships in reaction to that. And then Mao, Kissinger, and Nixon cut a deal, and suddenly China is allied with U.S. imperialism, including supporting all sorts of reactionary forces all around the world, like Pinochet in Chile and many other, dastardly regimes, South African apartheid, etc. So there was a flip on the part of China for its own geopolitical purposes to cut a deal of collaboration with the United States. Which had continued through the end of the Cold War and benefited economically, like we were talking about earlier, through that relationship. After the end of the Cold War, Russia emerges from the collapse of the USSR as a much diminished power in the world system, and so they have in many ways China looks at Russia as a cautionary tale of the consequences of if you lose party control of the state. And one of the big reasons they're so brutal in the crackdown on Tiananmen Square is they want to maintain the party state with a vengeance and avoid the fate of what happened in Russia and the Eastern Bloc of losing that party state party state control. So they begin to develop new relations after the end of the Cold War, and that accelerates really in the 2000s under Putin, when Putin rebuilds the Russian state as a nuclear-armed petropower, as a fossil capitalist player. And one of the big things that the Chinese economy needs is fossil fuels. It's one of the big consumers of fossil fuels in the world. And so it begins to develop economic relations with Russia. And those also morph into geopolitical relations through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is about really the coordination geopolitically of the border states between Russia and China, which are the transit points for a lot of the fossil fuels and materials that the Chinese economy uses. So they develop this geopolitical alliance, and then in particular, as the antagonism with the United States begins to develop, China and Russia come closer together in opposition to the United States, and especially through the BRICS alliance, the Brazil, Russia, India, China alliance, which has its own internal contradictions, but it's an important part of the development of a bloc in opposition to the United States, which is, not uniform to say the least. But China and Russia in particular share this antagonism that's developing between them and the United States, each for their own reasons. Russia and Eastern Europe and over who controls their former empire, the US and NATO, or Russia, and China with its antagonism that it's developing with the United States and the world economy. So this all comes to a head at the most recent Beijing Olympics, which the United States boycotted over China's record of human rights abuses, and in particular in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and the threats against Taiwan, etc. And so Russia, Putin and Xi Jinping meet in Beijing, and they strike their friendship without limits alliance. And I think that in this alliance, we should be clear that China is now the dominant partner in the alliance. It's now the biggest economy. It has, much more geopolitical heft than Russia does, and it also has a integration with the world economy that it doesn't want to lose, which is a little bit different than how Russia operates. So out of that alliance, I think whether China knew it or not, I don't know, but I think that alliance was part of Putin feeling like he had the green light to intervene in Ukraine and in an act of brutal imperialist aggression. And China has played a role of trying to it hasn't been critical of the intervention. It's tried to argue for some kind of peace negotiations, very much on Russia's terms. But I think it's very unhappy with what happened with Russian imperialism's invasion and attempted seizure of Ukraine, because it's enabled the US to rally all of NATO behind it, remilitarize it, and get most of the NATO powers to adopt the increasingly belligerent policies towards China. So the US, for example, just got NATO to declare China a country of strategic interests. So the US exploited the Russian imperialist invasion of Ukraine for its own purposes to rally its historic allies against China, which I think explains China's attempt to tamp the conflict down, even as they maintain their alliance with Russia, because the repercussions for the Chinese economy of, say, Germany de-risking its economic relations with China would be gigantic, huge repercussions for China's capitalist economy. So I think this is a very complicated relationship, we'll put it that way, in which China's the dominant power. The Russian state is really its dangerous little brother that it's trying to control, but it also has, big dependencies on for, fossil fuels in particular. So I think it's a complicated relationship, and it's part of the frightening dynamic of this new multipolar imperial order that we see, where the US is the dominant one, but now we have these rivals, China and Russia, around which there are flashpoints that are of great concern that could produce military conflicts. Ukraine being the obvious and immediate one. We have a war in Europe, a land war in Europe for the first time of this scale since World War II. And then we've got this flashpoint over Taiwan in the case of Asia, around which you have three nuclear armed powers in an antagonism: Ukraine, the US and Russia over Ukraine, and the US and China over Taiwan. So it's a very, frightening moment that we're entering.
So to close then, what stance should socialists in so-called Western states, where most listeners to this podcast live, take vis-a-vis China, which is the imperialist enemy of our imperialist ruling classes? Kevin?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely the right position to take, to think that the main enemy is at home. If you're Canadians or Americans, the main enemy is your own state. That's without a doubt. That should be the priority. But I do think if we are truly internationalists, as we should be as socialists, we want to support the working classes and other oppressed classes and nations elsewhere as well. So if we want to show solidarity, it should not be with those. It should be with those people, with the working classes, with oppressed people, not with their states. That distinction should be very, very clear. Sometimes that distinction is not made clear though. It becomes that the support for Chinese states is equated with supporting for the Chinese people. That's not the case at all. Again, not to say that there's no support among the Chinese population for the Chinese state, but I also think that's, our priority should be with the people, with the working classes, not with the state. I also think we should take into account the fact that there's now, by now, a very sizable, Chinese and Taiwanese and Hong Kong diaspora in the US, in Canada. Of course, we are not monolithic politically. There are left wings, there are right wings, there are a lot of people in between. But I think for a lot of us, the question of China is not a distant question. It's something that is very close to us. So when we talk about this question of the main enemy being at home, for a lot of diaspora groups, or for a lot of a large number of international students from China, from Hong Kong, and some from Taiwan, the question of China, U.S.-China rivalry and imperialism is not simply about opposing the Canadian or American state. It's that, but it's also, can we go beyond that? Can we also show solidarity with people on the ground to support their self-determination and their being free from any intimidation, coercion, aggression? I think that's a very important point to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I agree with everything that Kevin was just saying. I'll just add that I think much of the left has not caught up with the changes in the world, and are operating in outdated frameworks. And in particular, the outdated framework that people are operating in is the idea that we only have one imperialist power in the world system. And that was, common sense for everybody when the US emerged from the Cold War, and it was like this superpower with no rival. And it was, seeming to run the world as a new Rome through, the international trade deals it was cutting, through the international financial institutions, through the WTO. It had military bases all around the world, and it was dictating seemingly the political dynamics of the whole world system. And the left developed, rightly, a knee-jerk opposition to that imperialism. But as the whole discussion is talked about, that order of imperialism is now over. We've got a new situation in which there are inter-imperial rivalries that characterize the world system, and there are sub-imperial powers that are jockeying for regional position. Saudi Arabia or Israel or, other countries, Brazil, et cetera, that have geopolitical ambitions and economic, sub-imperial ambitions of their own. In that circumstance, the kind of we only oppose U.S. imperialism is not up to the situation we find ourselves in. It doesn't give you a guide to operating in this new situation where you have imperial antagonisms and antagonisms over oppressed nations that are caught up in the inter-imperial antagonism. So our method should be very clearly, if you're in the West, your number one enemy is at home, but that doesn't mean you should give any political support to other imperial powers, be it China or Russia. That is, we should not adopt the politics of my enemy's enemy is my friend. An enemy is an enemy. It's not a friend. And instead of falling for that mistaken position, we should oppose the US, but also impose its rivals and build movements of solidarity with struggles of oppressed nations and working classes and the left in those oppressed nations against whatever imperial power they're confronting, and especially make this argument in those movements that the choice is not to align the movement with this or that imperial power, but fight for genuine national liberation and for an internationalist politics that connects the people across the antagonisms together in a common struggle. Because in reality, the working classes of Hong Kong, the working classes of Puerto Rico, the working classes of Palestine, the working classes of Ukraine, the working classes of China, the working classes of Russia, of the Eastern European states, we all share far more in common with each other in a global capitalist system than we share in common with any of the states that run that system and fight for position within it. So oppose the US if you're in the US, but don't support its rivals, and build solidarity across borders in this multiracial, highly integrated global population whose common interests should be brought to the fore in common struggles for liberation.
Kevin, Ashley, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And While you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.